Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your free supplemental guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, I'm going to teach you how to read imaginative literature. In this lesson, I'm not seeking to teach you how to read in the sense of learning how to decode letters in their printed form and comprehend their meaning. Rather, what I want to achieve in this lesson is to teach you how to read intelligently, specifically how to intelligently read imaginative literature. In this video, you're going to learn about questions that you need to be asking while reading imaginative literature, and also certain prohibitions to keep in mind. Finally, we're going to learn that there's different types of imaginative literature, and each of these different types has different rules of reading. If you're going to intelligently read imaginative literature, you need to ask and answer 4 questions. Number 1, what type of imaginative literature am I reading? Number 2, what is this piece of imaginative literature about as a whole? Number 3, what is this piece of imaginative literature about in its details? And number 4, what do I think about this piece of imaginative literature? If you can fully answer these questions, then you're well on your way to being able to speak eloquently about them in class and produce high-quality papers on them. Let's take a look at these questions in more detail. The first question you want to ask yourself is this: what type of imaginative literature am I reading? 2 things about this question. Number 1, you want to ask yourself before you start reading. And number 2, this is not an absurd question to ask, as I'm sure it may seem to you upon first blush. The reason it's not an absurd question is because there are different ways to go about reading the different types of imaginative literature. So ask yourself this question: what type of imaginative literature am I reading? And again, I want to stress, do this before you start reading. So what then are the types of imaginative literature? Well, this type of literature is at its root fictional storytelling, and you're going to encounter it in the forms of novels, novellas, short stories, and plays. And since you're going to be encountering these 4 types of imaginative literature in book form, from now on in this video, I'll be referring to it mostly as books. The first type of book you're going to be reading is the novel. A novel is a fictional prose narrative of book length, that is, at least 60,000 words long in length. Examples of novels you're likely going to be encountering during your English language arts studies would be To Kill a Mockingbird, The Great Gatsby, The Catcher in the Rye, Things Fall Apart. By the way, all these novels are going to be treated by ELA Plus, so subscribe for updates. The second type of imaginative literature is the short story. The short story is similar to the novel in that it is also a fictional prose narrative. Though it's not as long, it's not of book length. Generally speaking, though there are no bright line rules, a short story is 10,000 words or less. ELA Plus wants to encourage you to read everything in printed form. So when you encounter short stories, you're going to be reading them in book form, either as the collected works of a single author or in an anthology of some sort. Nevertheless, the fact remains, no matter how you read them, that a short story is a fictional prose narrative of 10,000 words or less. You might be asking right now, well, what about fictional prose narratives with word counts between short stories and novels? Well, I'm glad you asked. Such works are called novellas. Novellas are longer than short stories, but not quite as long as novels. Examples include Animal Farm, The Old Man and the Sea, and Of Mice and Men. Eventually, all these works and many others are going to get analyzed by ELA Plus, so please subscribe for updates. The final type of imaginative literature that you're going to be asked to read are plays. Plays, or drama, are dramatic works meant to be performed by actors upon a stage. Most of the plays you're going to read are Shakespeare, and for good reason. The man is a genius, and quite frankly, he's the cornerstone of any proper English language arts curriculum. In fact, here at ELA Plus, the Shakespeare unit is going to be the first unit that we provide for you after this How to Read series. Now that you've identified the type of book you're reading, you need to ask yourself 3 questions while reading it. But before we get to reading, you first need to understand that there are 3 prohibitions on reading imaginative literature. Number 1, do not resist the effect the work of imaginative literature has on you. Number 2, do not look for terms, propositions, or arguments. And number 3, do not criticize fiction by the standards of truth and consistency that properly apply to communication of knowledge. The first prohibition is, do not resist the effect the work of imaginative literature has on you. What does this mean? What this means is that you must give yourself fully to the book and be open to it. Let it wash over you. Let it work itself upon you. You must understand that imaginative literature is different than informational literature. With informational text, you're reading for information or knowledge. This isn't necessarily the case with imaginative literature. With imaginative literature, the author isn't interested in sharing information per se. Rather, the author is interested in sharing experience. Melville wants you to experience monomaniacal drive and stringent conviction. Nabokov wants you to experience obsession and the descent into madness. Joyce wants you to experience what it's like to defecate in an outhouse and then wipe yourself with newsprint. This experiential aspect of imaginative literature is an exercise of the imagination not just on the author's part, but also on the reader's part. So don't resist it. Immerse yourself in the world that the author is creating for you. This is precisely how you're going to be able to answer the question, what is this book about as a whole? Now, I think that Adler and Van Doren get it exactly right when they wrote the following about reading imaginative literature. Become at home in this imaginary world. Know it as if you were an observer on the scene. Become a member of its population, willing to befriend its characters and able to participate in its happenings by sympathetic insight, as you would do in the actions and sufferings of a friend. If you can do this, the elements of fiction will cease to be so many isolated pawns moved around about mechanically on a chessboard. You will have found the connections that vitalize them into members of a living society. With all this said, it might seem like I'm suggesting you be a passive reader. I'm not. I'm absolutely not. While I do think that you should observe the prohibition on not resisting the effect the work of imaginative literature has on you, I don't want you to be reading with passive action. Rather, as Adler and Van Doren suggest, you should read with active passion. What this means is, while you're submitting yourself to the work as you read it, you want to be thinking about some global questions, such as, what is this work about as a whole? Who are the main characters? Why do they act the way that they do? How does this book relate to other books that I've read before? But keep these questions in the back of your mind while reading. Your primary objective while reading imaginative literature is to experience the work as the author intended. And in order to do this, you need to observe the first prohibition on reading imaginative literature. Do not resist the effect the work has on you. The second prohibition is, do not look for terms, propositions, or arguments. Remember what type of literature we're reading here. We are reading imaginative literature, not informational literature. These two types of literature, they use different methods to communicate their ideas. An informational text will rely on things like terms, propositions, and arguments to communicate its ideas. But with imaginative literature, the author is going to rely on plot, character, themes, style, voice. So focus on these when you're reading imaginative literature. And the final prohibition on reading imaginative literature is this. Do not criticize fiction by the same standards of truth and consistency that logically apply to communications of knowledge. In imaginative literature, truth is not expressed scientifically or empirically or technically. It's expressed, as we discussed before, experientially. Truth in informational text can be examined logically, and its claims and propositions can be tested in real life. That simply is not the case with imaginative literature. Let's take as an example the ancient Roman playwright Seneca and his play Thyestes. In that play, one character murders his brother's sons and then serves those sons up to his brother for dinner. How on earth are we to evaluate the truth of that particular experience? What I'm getting at here is that we do not evaluate imaginative literature with our intellect, with our reasoning mind. Rather, what we want to do is we want to evaluate it with our heart. We want to approach imaginative literature with empathy. Empathy for the avuncular, murderous cannibals of the world. Now, jokes aside, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's a categorical difference between the truth of a character's action and belief on the one hand, and, scientific or philosophical truth on the other. This goes back to the first prohibition. Do not resist the effect the work of imaginative literature has on you. The rules of this world may or may not be bound by the same rules of our everyday lives, and we shouldn't expect them to be. And those are the 3 prohibitions on reading imaginative literature. If you heed these prohibitions, you're not only going to be able to read imaginative literature, you're going to be able to read with a deep understanding and be able to answer the questions that we now need to ask ourselves about imaginative literature. We've already asked ourselves the first question, what type of imaginative literature am I reading? So now it's time to ask ourselves the second question, which is, what is this work of imaginative literature about as a whole? So clearly we're going to have to read the book. We're going to have to read the whole book. There's no shortcuts around this. You're just going to have to read the whole book and keep those prohibitions in mind. You understand a book when you can accurately state its plot in 1 or 2 sentences. The plot, that is the main story of a book, is essentially the main thesis of a work of imaginative literature. It's the backbone. It's what holds up the book. So if you can articulate its plot, then you truly do understand it. And that brings us to the third question we're going to ask ourselves while reading imaginative literature. And that question is, what is this work about in its details? The details of imaginative literature are things like character, setting, themes, and style. Characters in particular are very important details in a work of imaginative literature. So when you're thinking about characters, pay attention to what the characters say, what they think, what they listen to, who they don't listen to, how they get along with other characters, the relationships, and so forth. Pay particular attention to their feelings and, perhaps most importantly, what actions they take and for what reasons. When thinking about style, just ask yourself how the book reads. Is it flowery and purple with its prose, or is it written sparingly with direct sentences? What about the tone? Sad? Exuberant? How do all these things add up, and how do they support the overall plot? If you have a good handle on what the details of a work of imaginative literature are, and in addition, you can speak eloquently on what it is about as a whole, then you have a good grasp of what this book is about, and you're ready to ask yourself the final question of reading imaginative literature. That final question is, what do I think about this work of imaginative literature? What's my opinion on it? And this is it, folks. This is what we're going after here. In your English language arts studies, your teacher is going to ask you to write papers about a book. They're going to ask you questions in class about the book. And if you can articulate eloquently your thoughts on the book, proper criticism, then you're going to be an A+ student. Here are some things to keep in mind while developing your informed opinion of any book. Number 1, you want to be able to, in good faith, explain what the author's intentions were in this book. Number 2, you want to be able to say whether or not the author succeeded in communicating these intentions through the book. In order to do this, you're going to want to rely on the details of the book. So for instance, did the author make relevant use of characters, styles, and themes? Asking yourself these questions is going to empower you to develop your opinion on a book. It's going to allow you to not only say what you think about a book, but why you think that about a book. And this is very important for classroom discussion and also the production of academic papers. Okay, so before we wrap up here, let's have a brief talk about the different types of imaginative literature and how we might go about reading them in different ways. We already know that the different types of imaginative literature are novels, novellas, short stories, and plays. These, of course, can be further divided into either prose pieces or plays. By prose pieces, I mean the novels, the novellas, and the short stories that you're going to read. By plays, I mean plays, drama. Let's get into prose first. Remember that with prose, the author intends to deliver through her words an experience for the reader. So let her do that. Experience the author's world by reading very quickly and without interruption. Reading like this is going to empower you to immerse yourself in this fictional universe. To read prose adequately, you have to experience it. I really can't stress this enough. Reading imaginative literature is an experiential phenomenon. To get the most from this experience, it's necessary to read a prose piece in its entirety in a single sitting. For short stories, this is quite simple. All you have to do is block out some time in your day and then lose yourself in the story. For novellas and novels, on the other hand, this can prove difficult depending on the length of the work that you're reading. But what you want to do is at least get through a component part, like a chapter or a section, in a single sitting. While you're reading, I'd also hold back on judging characters favorably or unfavorably, unless you can honestly say why a character acts the way he or she does. Remember that characters are an element of imaginative literature that the author uses to move his plot forward. So what you really want to do before you judge these characters is truly live with them. And only then will you have the critical faculties requisite to judge them adequately. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate how very important it is to read your book without interruption. Remember, it's an experiential reading that you're after here. So turn off your phone. In fact, put all your electronic devices on the other side of the room and forget about them. Also, you don't really want to do any annotation during this initial reading. Forget about that. That's something you want to do with informational text, but not here. On subsequent readings, if you want to go deep into a book, then annotation is fine, it's even encouraged. But on this initial reading, what you want to do is immerse yourself and experience the fictional universe as the author intended. It is wise, however, to pause after chapter breaks and ask yourself some global questions really quickly. Questions like, who are the characters in this chapter? What did they do? How did the author move the plot along? Things like this. But again, don't spend too much time with these questions. Move along quickly and accept the world that the author has provided for you. You're also going to be reading plays. Plays are theater, Shakespeare, Miller, Williams, etc. Now, plays present a problem, don't they? Because the author intends for his play to be performed, not read. Unfortunately, most students are going to read a play rather than see it performed. So how does a student bridge this gap between seeing a play performed and reading the text in a book? One solution is to direct the play in your head as you read it. So what you want to do is talk to the characters as you're reading the play. Tell them how they're to perform their roles and for what reasons. This is a very good way to go about reading plays, I think, because an imaginative performance in your head is the second best experience for a play. So try it out. I think you'll get much better at understanding the play if you use this method. Okay, that concludes our video lesson on how to read imaginative literature. In this video, we reviewed the rules for reading imaginative literature, and we also reviewed the prohibitions on reading imaginative literature. So as always, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up with some comprehension questions to make sure that you understand all the material. And I really do encourage you to answer these questions down in the comments below. Doing so is going to help move the material from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. So let's take a look at these questions. Question 1. What are the questions to ask as you read imaginative literature? Question 2. What are the prohibitions on reading imaginative literature? Question 3. What are the types of imaginative literature? Question 4. What are the rules for reading prose? And question 5. What are the rules for reading plays? This concludes our lesson on how to read imaginative literature. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and your English teacher. If you have any questions about this video or other questions about your English language arts studies in school, please don't hesitate to ask down in the comments. I'm available, and I'll do my best to offer high-quality answers to anything you might want to know. ELA Plus is a free, regularly updated supplemental guide to the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.